Good morning. Our first witness this morning wishes to be known as Bill, does he?
Yes, sir.
Please.
Please state your full name.
William Wright. I am known as Bill.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Bill, you received factor VIII concentrate on one occasion and one occasion only in May 1986.
That's correct.
And you were infected with hepatitis C as a result.
It was initially termed non-A, non-B, but it was later termed hepatitis C.
Now, you'd had bleeding problems as a child. What can you tell us about that?
The first memory I have is of being in a regional hospital. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say which one. Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary. And as a very small child, being in a lit room, and I had a bump the size of a golf ball on my forehead. And I must only have been 3 or 4. And I remember being held down by the doctors and nurses. The daylight was behind me. It was a sunny day. And they came toward me with a massive, great syringe. My understanding of the purpose of that was to relieve the bulge in my head. And it's one of those moments that you don't forget. And obviously I was screaming. And in those days, you didn't have any parents around. I then had other incidents where my mother in particular remembers an incident where I had a really bad dental episode where I was bleeding from my teeth. And we had a very kind nurse next door who assisted, and somehow I lived in the village of New Abbey, which is 7 miles outside Dumfries, a beautiful wee village in Kirkcudbrightshire. And that was, I think, a bit of an event. There were 1 or 2 other episodes, but once I became a wee bit older, my situation was that I was pretty normal. And I had problems with bleeding noses as a teenager. I mean, I remember being admitted to Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary. And this is a bit grim, folks. I had bleeding noses when I ended up, of course, picking up them when they clotted. But generally speaking, I was very, very active. But I was given the old green haemophilia cards. And I think I need to check my factor VIII percentage at that time. They said it was either 30 or 40%, somewhere in that sort of region.
And as you've said, you led a very active life. You did lots of sports. And although you had been given a card as a mild haemophiliac, effectively, you did not require any treatment with any blood products during that period of your childhood?
No, not at all. I played football, bit of rugby, but my greatest passion my greatest passion were the mountains. And I say that with so much emotion because I cannot now climb mountains anymore. I, as a scout, used to visit the Galloway Hills, and I was absolutely hooked. We went into bothies at weekends, and we had a rare old time. Much of it was actually as much sitting around the bothy fire at nights as being in the pissing wet rain when the mist was down. But I went on to climb mountains across Scotland. In fact, much of the world. I climbed the highest mountain in Australia with Rosie and another friend. And I went on to work for the British Mountaineering Council and climb with some of the best climbers in Scotland. Sorry, in Britain. It was my great passion as a climber. I climbed into the extreme grades.
In 1974, you had some further investigations and tests at Glasgow Royal Infirmary. What can you tell us about those?
That's correct. The school system in Dumfries was a wee bit weird. If you, at that time, passed the old 11 plus, after the end of second year at secondary school, you went to, in the case of, even though I lived in Kirkcudbrightshire, you went to Dumfries Academy, which was kind of the equivalent of a grammar school. And I was fairly ambitious. Neither my mother or father had benefited from a full education. They couldn't afford it. So they pressed me to do the best in life in that respect. And I remember a meeting with the deputy headmaster of that school, the usual stuff, mother and father sitting there, me sitting here, him talking to them and saying, "This boy's not university material." And that obviously prompted me to look at other professional opportunities in life, in the likes of the police or the armed forces or whatever. But because I carried a haemophilia card, that was obviously going to be pretty tricky. So arrangements were made for me to go and spend a week in Glasgow Royal Infirmary and have a series of tests. I should mention, by the way, in relation to the deputy headmaster, I did go to university and I got a pretty damn good degree. But the purpose of that was to see how fit I was. And after a week's tests, they said, "No, you're fine, you don't need to carry a haemophilia card."
And we've got a couple of the documents we can see. If we have up on screen, please, Paul, 2287003. There's a letter, 7th of October 74, referring to some reports. We can take it there's no contraindication to his leading a completely normal life. That means there's no reason why he should not join the police force or the army. And then if we go to 2287003, please, Paul, next page. Thanks. We have a letter, the 18th of September 74, with the report. It talks in the first paragraph about you having been considered to suffer from mild haemophilia, leading a healthy, active life. And then it goes on to question whether or not you had mild haemophilia or mild von Willebrand's, identifies your factor levels and says, "I don't consider he can be regarded as suffering from mild haemophilia or indeed von Willebrand's disease." And so the way you've put it in your statement, Bill, is that from that point onwards you were effectively classified for medical purposes as like anybody else.
Yeah.
You did have a couple of bleeds after that, I understand.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I fell off Ben Nevis. I'd been climbing in winter on an ice route on the north face of Ben Nevis. And it was still in quite early days of my winter climbing career. And this was when I was still a student. I was, we'd taken the ropes and the harnesses off, and there was a blizzard running. I was actually with Rosie's brother climbing at the time, and this was before we got hitched, by the way, and I still married her. And as you do, we were coming down, and we just wanted to get the hell out of there, as you do when you're winter climbing in Scotland. It's a place that needs the deepest of respect. And basically, when you're trying to come down quick, you sit in your bum and take an ice axe behind you to brake. However, I went through a patch of very thick mist and suddenly find myself sort of over a drop, and I got stuck between an ice boss and the ground behind me. And I did that. The boss caught me on my chin, and I did that. And I was a bit stunned, and of course, Rosie's brother was miles away. And I managed to recover my position and thought, there's a bit of blood here. And he, when I caught up with him, says, oh, you're in a right mess. So I was admitted. I went that night to Belford Hospital in Fort William, and they stitched me up. 3 stitches on the outside and 2 on the inside. I can't remember quite which. And I have got a photograph, and it's not very pretty. It limited my love life for some time. The other occasion was a road traffic accident where, again in winter, we were driving to go climbing. It was just after I graduated, and I broke this finger. In fact, I had a compound fracture with bones sticking out of it. And it is actually true what they say, you're just as likely to have an accident driving to the mountains as on the mountains. So, they patched me up, and I pushed it all together, and I've still got the scar today, but it eventually recovered. It did rebleed. And it took some time because it seeped. But the problem I had was, when I'd first looked at it, there was actually sort of flesh sticking out and so on and so forth.
And you've described those occasions as missed opportunities to classify you as someone with either a mild bleeding disorder or at least somebody who was not to be regarded as entirely normal in that respect.
My factor VIII levels, to my knowledge, were never tested at that time.
You've said in your statements, Bill, that the fact that aged 16 in 1974 you were told completely normal in terms of bleeding, and that nothing further was picked up on either of the occasions where you didn't bleed in an entirely normal way, you think might have made a difference to what then happened in May 1986. Can you help us with that?
Well, because I didn't know what was about to happen a couple of weeks later, I can't fully recall the discussion with the GP or the accident emergency unit. Rosie has a better recollection than I of what we talked about when I came back from those visits. But, I mean, there are there's obviously reference to this in my medical records, but the actual, you know, I can't tell you word for word what the nature of that discussion. I remember where our GP was, and I vaguely remember the first visit to accident and emergency when I was sent home with a water in the knee. But I am dependent more on Rosie's recollections and what's in my medical records than my own recollections at that time.
But you weren't, by May 1986, when the events we're going to discuss next happened, you weren't essentially in any system in terms of either being classified as a haemophiliac or treated as such?
Absolutely not.
So May 1986, you sustained an injury to your left thigh.
Yes.
How did that happen?
The medical notes are wrong on that. Basically, I was on a visit to the Peak District, which was a mixture of a climbing and partying weekend. We got together with some friends from Portsmouth. And instead of falling off the crag, I slipped in the path on the way down to a quarry called Lawrencefield. And I remember falling quite heavily because I'd got a heavy rucksack with gear on and not thinking a great deal about it. And then, as often happens in a lot of climbing weekends, it rained. So we did a mixture of things which involved either going to the pub or we actually had, in a place called Froggatt Barn, we actually had, and it's probably about the same distance, this barn's about the same distance as from Sir Brian to you. And there was about 20 of us playing football on a concrete floor in there. And that, of course, didn't help. And I eventually that weekend drove home, and this thigh was twice the size of my right thigh. And I thought, this is not very clever, which, of course, drew me to it. Rosie said, you better go and see the doctor.
So you went to see your GP, and what did the GP say?
He sent me up to A&E.
He said rest.
Yes, he said, first of all, rest, which I did. I was off work for a week, 10 days, something like that.
And it didn't get any better, and you went back to the GP?
Well, it got bigger. And I went back to the GP, and he then sent me up to A&E.
And one of the observations you've made in your statement is that there was no communication between the GP and the hospital about anything to do with your medical background. You were simply sent to A&E.
Yeah, just take yourself up and see what they say. They'll X-ray it or whatever.
This was the A&E at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh?
The old Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, which the chairman will be well familiar with.
And what did they do on this first visit to A&E?
I think they said, you have water in the knee, just go home. Can I make an observation on that,
absolutely.
Please? I've obviously reflected on this quite a lot. When you're in our position or my position, you think about missed opportunities. There was no gatekeeping. There was no system where you walked in the door. No visible, you've got a bleed, you've got a hematoma. We need to take you from there and take you down a different path, admit you, put you on bed rest, and look at the options. Now, it's been claimed that there were systems in place. And during the evidence that my consultant, Professor Ludlam, Professor, I may make a comment on that. that there was a system in place. We never saw any evidence of it.
Having been simply sent home on that first trip to A&E, on the basis that you might have water on the knee, what then happened?
You got better and went back to work.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I'm quite tired. It's been a long week. I did go back to work. And Rosie at the time, we had a wee flat in the Grassmarket. We were about to get married in 3 months. We had a tiny wee flat. And I remember, because Rosie was on night shift, in sort of mid-evening, I was standing washing the dishes, having come home from work, I don't know, 6, 7 o'clock after tea. And I suddenly felt a pang of pain. And the pain remained. So I thought, oh boy, this is not good. There was no NHS 24 in those days. So I took myself up to accident emergency in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary.
Now, at the point at which you'd previously gone to accident and emergencies, I understand it, you hadn't been seen by any haematologist on that occasion?
No.
You hadn't been asked anything about any history of bleeding?
Not that I can recall.
And there was no testing of your factor levels?
No.
So this second visit to the Accident and Emergency Department was late on the 13th of May 1986.
That's correct.
What can you recall about that?
Being on a trolley for 2 hours.
And then what?
Well, I was then in considerable pain because anybody that's had a rebleed into a large hematoma in their thigh will know what that's like. And I was also pretty tired. But I do remember this young doctor, and he did say to me, "We're going to give you something." One of the things was gas and air, and I now know about gas and air Entonox because I have survived 2 child labours. So I now know what that stuff does. But there was no, I never had any discussion about what was about to be done to me. There wasn't a discussion, and there wasn't any explanation.
You've said in your statement that you have a vague recollection of being asked some questions by nursing and medical staff.
Yeah.
And you informed them of your previous possible diagnosis of haemophilia.
Yeah.
And then a point in time came at which you were given something. Were you told even what it was that you were going to be given?
I don't think so.
And you weren't told of any risks of infection that might follow from the treatment that you were going to be provided with?
No.
And that treatment, as you subsequently learnt, was factor 8.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any assessment of your factor levels, any clotting screen undertaken as far as you know prior to that?
No, and there's no record in my medical records of that. And for me, that's obviously an opportunity missed.
Now, the at some point the following morning, these events happened overnight, 13th to the 14th of May 1986, and at some point you saw Dr. Ludlam on the 14th, and you were told you'd been given Factor 8 products. Were you told anything on the 14th, as far as you can recall, about...
I vividly recall that moment.
Will you then tell us that vivid recollection, please?
I was in a room on my own. It was one of these old single rooms in the Royal Infirmary with very tall walls and not particularly big. And I was pretty woozy because they'd given me a lot of sedatives the night before. In fact, Dr. Ludlam told me they'd give me enough to put a horse out. And he then informed me that I was a haemophiliac and that they'd given me Factor 8. And my immediate reaction to that was, he assured me that I'd be okay. But my immediate reaction to that was, I'd seen enough in the media at that time. Living in Edinburgh, which in the mid-1980s, frankly, was North Edinburgh, was the AIDS and hepatitis B capital of Europe because of intravenous drug use. Being quite worried and alarmed about that, he reassured me about that. Nevertheless, I was, of course, later to receive a hepatitis B vaccination. So when he informed me about the possibility of non-A, non-B, his tones were very reassuring.
And when he told you about the possibility of non-A, non-B in that reassuring manner, that was on the 14th of May 1986?
Yes.
That first meeting with
Yes.
Dr. Ludlam, a few hours after you'd received the Factor 8.
Yep.
You were told straight away, pretty much after you'd been given the treatment, that you might get non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Yes. The words were, you have a 50% possibility of contracting non-A, non-B. Because when you've been through such a drama, you remember moments like that.
We have details of what you received in terms of the actual product and batch number in a letter a number of years later, dated the 6th of December 1996. Paul, it's 2287007, please. And we can see it's a letter from John Hanley to Dr. Ludlam, 6th of December 96. I've checked the blood product records on this patient. Date of Factor 8 infusion 14th of May, batch number 0430, units 2000, 10 bottles. And then he says this, I've asked the PFC to clarify which virus inactivation method was used on this batch. From the beginning of 1985, NY was heated at 68 degrees for 24 hours. From mid-1986, heat treatment on Z8 at 75 degrees for 72 hours was introduced. After only a few batches, this was changed to 80 degrees for 72 hours. And then if we look at the next paragraph, I think almost certainly that this batch was heated at 68 degrees for 24 hours. I'll confirm this as soon as the PFC get back to me next week. This method of heating did not effectively eliminate HCV. So your understanding is that the Factor 8 product with which you were treated was, as described here, heated at 68 degrees for 24 hours, which did not effectively at that stage eliminate HCV.
That's correct.
Now, we've got, and you've provided to the inquiry, 2 letters written by 2 of the doctors who were involved overnight on the 13th and 14th of May 1986 with your treatment. And we'll just look at those, please, Bill. Paul, the first in time is 2287009. We can see this is a letter from the registrar, 16th of May 1986, to Dr Ludlam, says this: I was called at approximately 1 a.m. on Wednesday the 14th of May by Dr McClure, casualty officer, to be told about a Mr Wright who'd sustained a traumatic haematoma in the left thigh several days prior to that evening. Refers to you having previously been seen by orthopaedic surgeons. He was thought to be a mild haemophiliac and had re-bled into his left thigh. I asked what sort of haemophilia, A or B, he has. The casualty officer was uncertain. I therefore said I'd ring the resident on call for Ward 23 in order to clarify the diagnosis from any records we had. Just pausing there, the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh Haematology Centre at that stage would have had no records relating to you, presumably.
No.
I next asked the infirmary switchboard to connect me to the resident on call. I was initially put forward to Dr Filshy and told him the story, but he was only on call until midnight, therefore I was transferred to, and that's redacted, but in fact there's no reason why you can't mention the names, Bill, that's just an out-of-date document. It's a Dr Austin.
Yes.
I told Dr Austin the problem, asked him to find the notes in the haemophilia centre, transfer the patient to the centre and ring me back with a diagnosis and we would consider therapy. Anticipating being up most of the night, I fell asleep awaiting the call. The next thing I knew, the alarm went at 7 a.m.
She fell asleep.
So that's the account from that doctor again.
She didn't come in.
That's Dr Craig. Again, although it's redacted there, Bill, that's just that's being removed.
She was the responsible person who was overseeing. And can I offer a view as to what I think happened there?
Certainly. Do you want to do it after we look at the letter from
Sorry,
Dr
apologies.
Austin? Well, no, it's entirely a matter for you, Bill, as to whether...
Might I take my jacket off?
Of course.
I'm sorry, I'm quite warm.
I should say, sir, whilst Bill's doing that, these letters have relatively recently been provided to the inquiry and the doctors involved have therefore not been notified. But they will be asked to provide a response if appropriate. We do, in fact, have their near contemporaneous accounts in any event in this correspondence. So, Bill, the second letter is 2287008. And this is dated the 4th of July 1986. Again, just so that we can make sense of it, the first letter was from Dr Craig to Dr Ludlam. This is from Dr Austin to Dr Ludlam. I write to you in connection with my involvement in the management of Mr William Wright. My first knowledge of this patient came during a telephone call from Dr Craig at her home at about 2 a.m. on the 14th of May. She told me a haemophiliac had presented in casualty with a thigh bleed. He had a lifelong history of prolonged bleeding and easy bruising and had carried a haemophilia card to school. He'd been seen recently in casualty by the orthopaedic surgeons but had now returned and would need haematological intervention. Dr Craig indicated she preferred not to come into the hospital herself and hoped that I would be able to deal with the case. I tried to clarify her instructions, asking whether factor VIII would be indicated. Her reply, as I understood it, left me with the impression that this would be the case. I then contacted Dr McClure, the casualty officer who'd seen Mr Wright and who'd originally spoken to Dr Craig. He confirmed that she'd outlined a similar line of treatment to his, and so I asked him to send the patient up to the haemophilia centre. When I saw this patient on Ward 23, he had a tense left thigh haematoma and was in considerable distress. I gave him 2,000 units of factor VIII and provided him with analgesia, and then it talks about the arrangements for your admission. So those are the two accounts provided to Dr Ludlam, the first account 2 days after the events, the other a few weeks later. What observations would you like to make?
Well, the first observation I have is that those accounts were never given to me. Dr Ludlam sat on this for 10 years without telling us. And it was only when we served a summons that we learned what was happening. And it's for the inquiry to judge. But the fact that Dr Ludlam had asked for those letters about me and not provided me with a copy, and we had to go chasing after our medical notes, is a matter for the inquiry to decide whether or not that's fair. The second point about this, and I was pretty shocked when after 13 years, we were shocked. We were very shocked after 13 years when we saw this. The second observation I have is I do remember the young, what would be an F1 at the time, being there, and I wasn't aware of the where the phone calls that were taking place, but I was sort of somewhere in the background. There was obviously some discussion about trying to check up on something, whether it was my history or whatever. But nevertheless, for me, I was given that product and I was there for 2 hours. I mean, you can conduct a factor VIII test down in the lab fairly quickly. In fact, we've had that experience since. I've been in and out of casualty in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary to check on a bump in my wrist in 45 minutes. And that was about 4 or 5 years ago. On a Saturday afternoon at 4:45, you can check factor VIII levels very readily. And I've learned that I was given this product that had such a dramatic effect on my life without testing my factor VIII level beforehand.
One inference that could be drawn from the letters is that there were failures of communication. Although the letters weren't provided to you at the time, was the possibility of failures of communication ever conveyed to you by Dr. Ludlam or any others at that time?
Well, I remember what he said the next morning. He acknowledged that there had been a bit of a drama last night. But bear in mind, I'd got a working great hematoma in my leg. I'd been up till quite late and then been given enough to put a horse out. So the exact detail of that conversation, even if he was passing information to me at the time, he was doing so in a position where I was in a very vulnerable position. And I mean, the only thing I do recall was that the circumstances perhaps been somewhat contentious.
Have you seen in any of your records, subsequently obtained, any evidence of any consideration having been given to any alternatives to factor VIII?
No. You mean DDAVP or cryoprecipitate or bed rest or transaminase or whatever? No.
You, many years later, became aware of the existence of DDAVP as a possible alternative. I think you were treated a number of years later with DDAVP.
You bet.
And if we have up on screen 2287011, this is a letter that was written to you by Dr. Evans, who I think you met through a Haemophilia Society function.
Yes, Llandudno in North Wales. We were living at the time in Cheshire, and there's a bit of a gap here because this was in April 1996. 96. And we had 2 children by then. And I went out to this Haemophilia Society gathering, and I got another shock because I was sitting in a room and Dr. Evans was there, and there was, I can't remember, 10, 15, 20 people, 15, 20 people there. And that I'd not met before. and had met Dr. Evans before. And we're talking about each other's circumstances. And somehow my story came up about having been infected in 1986 in Scotland with my haemophilia levels 30–40%. And they all looked at me. Whoa, this is a bit weird. And I, obviously, when you're a bit of an oddity, you take note of that. And they're asking me questions about that and saying, 30–40%, 1986. And at that point, I realised something was seriously wrong. I had gone for 10 years. We had gone for 10 years. Apart from what happened in 1988, never realising that my infection might have been avoided.
And if we look at this letter, what Dr. Evans was here telling you about the use of DDAVP in mild haemophilia was this: although it was known as long ago as 1977 that DDAVP raised factor VIII levels in mild haemophilia and von Willebrand's disease, it took a little time before it was realised it could be used regularly for treatment. It was not until October 1983 that a leading article appeared in The Lancet, which made the following statements: DDAVP can be used to treat patients with mild haemophilia, carriers of haemophilia with low factor VIII concentrates, and patients with VWD. Now that blood products may transmit the factor responsible for the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome as well as hepatitis, the advantages of DDAVP for certain patients have become more obvious. That was a publication in The Lancet in October 1983. In fairness, I should point out that Dr. Evans goes on to say there's no comment that it's the treatment of choice for mild haemophilia. At the time, I do not think that it was generally agreed by haemophilia centre directors that it should always be used for mild haemophilia. And then he talks about a problem that can arise when emergency treatment is needed on someone who hasn't been tested to see if DDAVP worked. But that's when you realised that there had been a possible alternative treatment of DDAVP back in May 1986.
Yes.
Which, as far as you understand, was never considered for your treatment.
Correct.
Just returning to 1986.
Well, can I just make a comment on that?
Absolutely.
With respect to the meeting we had with Dr. Ludlam in 1999, which we might come on to.
Yep.
I mean, he expressed views about DDAVP. My experience later, or my experience had been, DDAVP really worked. In fact, it really worked too well when I had a liver biopsy.
What did Dr. Ludlam say when you met with him in 1999 about DDAVP?
Might I be able to pass that question to Rosie later
Yes,
when
absolutely.
she gives
When
evidence?
Rosie gives her evidence, I'll ask her that. Thank you.
She was with me.
Returning then to 1986, can we have up on screen, please, Paul, 228710. Now, this is a letter not part of your medical records. I understand you saw this for the first time in the course of the Penrose inquiry.
Yes.
Is that right? It's a letter 27th of June 1986. It's from Mr. Bolton, Deputy Director of the Edinburgh and South East Scotland Regional Blood Transfusion Service, to Dr. Perry, the Director at the PFC. And it says this: Dear Bob, may I pass on to you a couple of verbal comments about blood products from Christopher Ludlam? And then we can skip over the first paragraph. And then it says this: a young haemophiliac who previously had minimal therapy with factor VIII received an infusion of the current heat-treated product a month ago. He now shows signs of liver enzyme rises indicating non-A, non-B hepatitis. Christopher is a bit ruthful with his own staff about this because he feels that this patient should have received 8Y or an equivalent product. However, the patient is apparently quite well clinically. As far as you understand, this description is about you.
This came as a massive shock. During the course of the Penrose inquiry, in the preliminary report, there was reference to this young man of 28-year-old at the time, in 1986. And the description fitted me perfectly. And it was yet another bits of the learning exercise that we've all come to experience during the course of this story. And I think I was in the house at the time, and the usual thing, I was jumping up and down. Poor Rosie was having to... But I now saw it, and of course I started to then flick through, having seen the reference in the preliminary report, I then started to go through this whole series of correspondence of letters about me, again about me, that I had never, ever been made aware of.
This is a matter of weeks since your treatment.
Yes. It's actually not quite accurate, by the way, because by then, the patient is apparently quite well clinically. I think by June, July, August, my ALT levels were hitting 1200. Again, anybody that's familiar with the experience of hepatitis C knows what that's like. So it took a while for my body to get used to it. I mean, I vividly remember I was on a sailing trip down at Kielder Reservoir, and I threw up on a weekend we had down there. Didn't help that I capsized the dinghy 20 times, but that's another story. But, you know, at that point, my hematoma was recovering, and I was trying to get back into the outdoors. But I vividly remember the really serious nausea that I had at that time as my body adjusted.
The other slight inaccuracy, as I understand it in this letter, is that you'd not previously had minimal therapy with factor VIII, you'd had
none.
zero therapy
None.
with
Zero.
factor VIII. Now, this is a few weeks after your treatment. You are by this time under the care of Christopher, Dr. Ludlam. Did he ever express to you a degree of ruthfulness, or tell you that he felt that you should have received 8Y or an equivalent product?
No.
We're just going to look at a handful of other documents that I know you're familiar with, again, through Penrose rather than through having been provided to you at any earlier stage.
May I just ask a question here? The significance of 8Y is that would be the English product, which had been heat-treated to a level which subsequently was found to convey no hepatitis.
The evidence, sir, had been since on the English product. It hadn't received, it was a trial product.
At the time?
Yes, but I have a wee bit of a weird view on, well, it's not a weird view, I believe it's a logical view in terms of a period of trial. You may try a product on 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people. By the time you get to 10 people, you're starting to build a picture. By the time you get to 20, you've got a better picture. By the time you get to 30, you've got a very good picture. And if that's the best product available, then you reach toward it for the safety of the patient. So the evidence, as I understand it, was certainly by the autumn of 1985, the English, no offence guys, were pretty pretty confident that that was the best product for them.
But the implication of this would be that Dr. Ludlam in Edinburgh thought that the department there had a choice available to them of giving you 8Y rather than the Scottish heat-treated product, which was known or thought to be not yet effective against hepatitis.
He later secured a supply. Just after I was infected, he secured a supply of 8Y.
And those are the letters we're about to look at, sir.
I see. I'm jumping the gun.
You are, but to reach the correct outcome in terms of the issues that are being explored. So we have that letter, 27th of June, 1986. We then, if we could have up on screen, Paul, and these are the Penrose references, please, Paul. So PRSE 0004097, please. So we're now on the 7th of July 1986, and Mr. Bolton, the Deputy Director, again, of the Regional Blood Transfusion Services, writing to Dr. Perry again at the PFC saying this: "Sorry to be pestering you again. Last week, Dr. Ludlam wrote to Brian asking if it would be possible to obtain some of the BPL products for use if a previously untreated haemophiliac presented for replacement therapy." And then there was a discussion about quantities, and the request is made at the end of the letter for possibly 10,000 units, or if not, about 4,000. So we see, I don't think we've got the letter that Dr. Ludlam wrote, but by the end of June or beginning of July, he has requested some of the BPL 8Y products. If we turn on, please, Paul, to PRSE 0000702. This is a letter from Perry to the Blood Products Laboratory, to BPL and Elstree, dated the 10th of July 1986. Very occasionally, a haemophiliac without previous exposure to factor VIII concentrate, such as Ubil, presents in Scotland for treatment. One such virgin patient presented very recently and was treated with our current product, 68 degrees for 24 hours, and subsequently developed markers for non-A, non-B hepatitis, although he remains clinically well. It's our intention, as you probably know, to introduce a product heated at 80 degrees for 72 hours within the next 2 months, and which will be comparable in terms of non-infectivity with your 8Y product. Pending the introduction of this product in Scotland and Northern Ireland, I write to ask if it would be possible for you to supply PFC with a very modest quantity of 8Y, 50 vials, to cover the treatment of similar virgin patients who may appear between now and September. This request originated from our own haemophilia directors, and in light of our imminent introduction of a product comparable to 8Y, does not seem unreasonable and should not place an overwhelming burden on your supply. If we then have up on screen PRSE 0003693, please, Paul. This is a letter, 24th of July. It's from BPL, Mr. Pettit at BPL, back to Dr. Perry at the Protein Fractionation Centre in Edinburgh. It refers to the letter on the requirements for virgin haemophiliacs. And then it proposes perhaps Scotland would like to participate in our trial of factor 8Y. And then 4 paragraphs down, in case there are some patients who do not strictly meet the criteria for trial now or in the future, I've put aside some 8Y for immediate dispatch to PFC or any other destination if you require it. I can arrange same-day delivery if necessary. Would you like this additional product to be sent to PFC now, or have you made adequate arrangements for cover? And then just 2 more letters, Bill, before I ask you to comment on them. PRSE 0001397, please. This is the same date, 24th of July. We can see Dr. Perry writing here to the Plasma Fractionation Laboratory in Oxford, making the same request to them. I'd be grateful if you could supply PFC with 50 vials of 8Y as a contingency in the event that a virgin haemophiliac presents for treatment. And then, if we have, please, Paul, PRSE 0002616. 1st of August 1986, the response from the Oxford Plasma Fractionation Laboratory to the PFC in Edinburgh, as requested, I'm sending attached 50 vials of 8Y3312 in case you wish to protect Category 1 patients before your Z8 is ready. And then last letter bill, PRSE 0004290. This is from Dr. Perry, 4th of August, to Dr. Bolton at the Transfusion Service at the Royal Infirmary. Dear Frank, NANB transmission in virgin haemophiliacs, just a note to conclude these discussions. Could you let me know the batch of factor VIII involved in the transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis to Dr. Ludlam's virgin patient? Again, you understand that to be you. Whilst this outcome of treatment is not surprising, we need to know the batch number and dose to keep our surveillance cross-referencing records complete.
I was being watched.
We'll see that from some later letters as well, Bill, after you moved from Edinburgh to Manchester. We see recorded in this letter of the 4th of August 1986 that the outcome of treatment, presumably referring to the transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis to you, is described there as not surprising. The earlier exchange of correspondence shows a request being made after you have been treated with factor VIII for there to be effectively an emergency provision of it from either Elstree or Oxford to Edinburgh to cater for circumstances identical to those in which you presented yourself at the Royal Infirmary. And as I understand it, your question is why that wasn't done earlier.
Well, in terms of following this correspondence, they're all very pally. It's not like a Scotland-England battle here. The people in Scotland managed to get the English stuff very readily, in my conclusion, reading this. Can I add a further comment about
Absolutely.
this? I only learned about all of this when the preliminary report of the Penrose inquiry came out. And with colleagues in the legal team, we thought this was an extremely significant matter, but we didn't get to explore it during that inquiry in the depth that the strategic issues that it raised could have been explored. This is the first time I've been a witness at an inquiry. I was never invited to that inquiry to rehearse what we're just rehearsing now.
Your supplemental statement makes the criticism or the observation that there appears to have been no system in place in Edinburgh to ensure that previously untreated patients such as yourself did not receive factor VIII treatment and instead were considered for alternative treatments.
Yes.
And amongst alternative treatments, do we include here the experimental, apparently successful 8Y?
Yes, that could have been an option, along with DDAVP or cryo or whatever.
And if we just go back to the letter 2287010, please, Paul. So in that second paragraph, you will see it's there being recorded by Mr. Bolton that it's Dr. Ludlam who feels a few weeks after the 14th of May
the wrong
that the
paragraph.
patient...
Sorry, yes, that's a correct paragraph, yeah.
That it's recording there that Dr. Ludlam feels that this patient should have received 8Y or an equivalent product.
I mean, subject to what is later to be said to me by Dr. Professor Ludlam or others, this may carry the implication that he thought that there was a particular risk from Scottish product, which there was not, or likely not to be present, in the English product.
So that's certainly one inference, and I should, of course, have added that Dr. Ludlam has been asked to respond,
Yes.
and we understand is intending to respond.
That would have been the case at that point, sir.
And if he knew it, then other haemophilia directors in Scotland would have known it, and the question then arises why it was that the Scottish product wasn't successful in the same way, although it does appear steps were being taken towards that end.
Can I
Yes,
make an
of course,
observation on that? It came to our attention during the Penrose inquiry that actually that supply of 8Y that Dr. Ludlam obtained was retained in Edinburgh, and it did not become available to other haemophilia centres in Scotland. I think I'm correct in saying that.
Bill, you've returning then to your own personal circumstances whilst this correspondence is ongoing. By July 1986, you were feeling unwell.
Initially, I felt very unwell. Once the hematoma had, I spent a period in hospital on bed rest, and I had to have physiotherapy on my knee. But I was a young man, and we were about to get married. And I was, the reason we got together is we both love the outdoors. So I remember there was the episode at Kielder-Water, but there were other times where I was really struggling. I was a fit guy in terms of climbing hills and so on. And I remember trying to walk into Knoydart, which is a very remote part of Scotland, and being absolutely knackered. So it took quite a long time. Eventually, I actually did become fit again, and I actually understand very, very well why it is that some people can have been affected with hepatitis C and for years feel perfectly well. Because after my body had adjusted to the initial impact of the viral load, and I got back to climbing hills, and in '93 I climbed the Old Man of Hoy, which is by no means the hardest thing I did, and did days in the hills where I would walk 30 miles and 8,000 feet. So for a while I did recover my fitness, for a while, till I got on to interfering.
But it was July 1986 when you had the raised ALT results that you've referred to, and when you were told by Dr. Ludlam that you had non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What can you recall him telling you about the nature or seriousness of that condition?
Well, I can't tell you word for word.
No.
But we gained an understanding that it was not a particularly serious. In other words, the impression that the receipt of what was being communicated to us was such that we understood it was not a particularly serious condition. At that time, some people may remember in the mid-80s, they talked about chronic active and chronic persistent. And there seemed to be a wish to reassure me. The intent behind that, again, is not a matter for me, it's a matter for the inquiry.
You got married to Rosie in August of that year.
Yep.
And the following year you...
Best thing I ever did.
And the following year you moved to Manchester.
Yep.
2 years later, you moved to Edinburgh. And 3 years later, you moved to Penrose. And the following year you moved to Manchester. And the following year you moved to Edinburgh. And the following year you moved to Manchester. you registered with a new GP and you were referred to the Manchester Royal Infirmary Haemophilia Centre, where in due course you were seen by another consultant.
I wonder if at this point, sir, we might be able to take this break that I requested,
Yes,
because
certainly.
Yes.
I'm afraid there's a fair bit of story to come. I'm looking around the room because I obviously hope that I'm not going to indulge on people's time too much that have come, but might we have, say, 10, 15 minutes just to get a cup of tea?
Well, would 10 minutes do you think?
10 minutes would do fine.
Let's take 10 minutes.
I can inspect the plumbing as well, so. Okay.
Just after 11:20.
Okay.
Bill, we'd got to 1987, 1988,
Yep.
the period when your care transferred to Manchester and you came under the care of a different consultant there.
Yes.
And what did he tell you?
Well, we'd moved to Cheshire. It actually took quite a long time for us to A, register with haemophilia unit, and B, then to be referred to a hepatologist. And in the drama of this was really one of the absolutely most memorable days of my life. By that stage, I'd gone to work for the British Mountaineering Council in Manchester, who had premises within the university precinct of Manchester University. And it was actually really within that precinct was also Manchester Royal Infirmary. And by the time we eventually got around to buying a house, because we had to rent various places in between. We actually lived in an elderly care home for about 3 months, I think, because Rosie was a social worker and managed to pull the opportunity. But I vividly remember that afternoon because this was my first visit, I think, to see a hepatologist. And I walked into this waiting room and it was huge. There was piles of people there. And my appointment, I had to be there at 1 o'clock. 4 hours later, I'd still not been seen, as one by one by one by one, people went into the room. So I was pretty grumpy by the time I went into this consultant. And you talked about Sir Percival, Sir. Well, I'm afraid I was a bit of a grumpy young Scotsman in terms of having been kept for that length of time. Anyway, he looked at my notes, I think, did one or two things, and he then told me that I might have only 10 years to live. By that time, I was 30-year-old. I now have my bus pass. So I then walked back to the offices, and I remember draping over the filing cabinet, as you do, and telling the General Secretary, who was still there by that time, it was about 6 o'clock at night, and the office was empty apart from the General Secretary, and telling him this story. And I phoned Rosie.
And it was only once you were under the care of the Manchester Royal Infirmary that you understood that your condition was a very serious and chronic one.
That's absolutely correct.
And it's at that point, as I understand your witness statement, and indeed that of Rosie, that you were given, what you say for the first time, advice and information about risks of cross-infection and about the nature of the condition and the steps you might need to take.
Yeah.
You've suggested in your witness statement that the risks and seriousness of your condition had been effectively played down in Edinburgh.
Yes.
Is it your belief that they were played down because you think Dr. Ludlam knew you shouldn't have been given factor 8?
Oh boy. The question of intent.
You may not have a view, Bill, in which case there's no need for you to express one, but this is your opportunity to if you do.
He was clearly severely embarrassed. And maybe later you may wish to put the same question to Rosie, who had experience of Dr. Ludlam. But he was not taking us aside and saying, look, things went wrong here. He didn't give us the advice that Dr. Evans gave us, which was to consult a solicitor. And indeed, some years later, we felt that he was trying to talk us out of it.
You have learnt through looking again at your medical records that even after you transferred to Manchester, Dr. Ludlam was in contact with your doctors and had asked to be kept informed of your progress.
Yes.
We'll just look at a couple of letters. It's 2287004. This is a letter of the 7th of December 1987 from Dr. Ludlam to Dr. Delamore at the Department of Haematology at Manchester Royal Infirmary. It's writing to let them know that you've moved into the Manchester area. It explains, or it makes reference to the events in May of 1986. It talks about you being treated with a single injection of factor VIII concentrate and developing non-A, non-B hepatitis following the factor VIII infusion. And then it says this: when he is reviewed at your clinic, I should be most grateful if you could send me a note of his latest LFTs, as I shall be interested in the continuing documentation of this unfortunate episode of hepatitis. Mm-hmm. Were you aware that Dr. Ludlam had asked to be kept informed?
Well, not in relation to this letter. There is reference to when I informed Dr. Ludlam that we're leaving Edinburgh, of him referring me to that I should register with a haemophilia unit once we got settled. But I didn't realise I was being watched to this extent.
And we can see there's a further exchange of correspondence, or further correspondence. If we look at 2287005, please, Paul, and we go to the 4th page, we can see there's a letter, 3rd of May 1988, from a consultant haematologist to Dr. Ludlam, explaining that he'd seen you on Dr. Delamore's behalf in the haematology outpatient clinic. Refers to the results and says we should be following up and we'll keep you informed as to how things go on. And then there's various later correspondence in the course of 1988 between the Manchester Royal Infirmary and Dr. Ludlam.
I wonder here, the ALT readings here prompt me about a matter we covered earlier in relation to
yes.
when I was first infected, and the confidence about being told that I had got non-A, non-B. And this is something obviously I've agonised about over the years, because, and I'm sorry, I should have covered it when we discussed this period immediately after I was infected in Edinburgh. Is it okay to return to this?
Yes, absolutely.
The reason that they were so confident that I had been infected and I was positive for non-A, non-B were my liver function tests. And I puzzled and puzzled and puzzled and puzzled about this. And I'd been a blood donor prior to my infection. And there's quite a bit of coverage in the Penrose report about this question of testing blood donations for ALT levels. And in terms of the communication I was receiving, the reason that they gave that they were so confident that I'd been infected was my ALT levels. And that, when I puzzled about it, it made me think, well, why weren't they testing the donors? And of course, I since became aware when I've read up on all of this, they were using ALTs tests in Germany in 65, in Italy, I think 70s or 80s or so, you know, much before. Other countries were using the test much before. And I understand there are issues about false positives and false negatives. In other words, somebody could have been infected and their ALTs hadn't risen. But I also very vividly recall, a meeting that I attended in Edinburgh in the year 2000 that had been set up with the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service and the Haemophilia Society. And there were 2 points in particular. The meeting is minuted, where a senior official from the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service questioned that someone could have been infected in 1986 in Scotland, and it was someone called Karen Pappenheim who led that meeting. She was the chief executive in London with the Haemophilia Society at the time, and most of us infected that were there were pretty silent. And I put my hand up and said, he basically didn't believe there was anyone that could have been infected. I put my hand up and said, it's me. But the other thing that I remember from that was the remark that about ALT levels, that if donations had been tested, one of the reasons, and there was of course costs involved in that, in testing donations. One of the reasons that there may have been difficulties in testing people, the officials' words were, they might have had a good drink the night before. And I remember thinking, if you live in certain parts of Scotland, the idea of what's a good drink might be interpreted rather, shall we say, there may be different interpretations upon that. Sorry, I have diverted, but I think it's really a very significant point for me.
You said you'd wanted to make the point about ALTs, so that's fine. Over the years that followed from you being told of the seriousness of your condition in Manchester, and you and Rosie established your life there, you had children.
Yep.
You became very careful not to infect them through
Yes.
the precautions that you felt you had to take, razors,
Yes.
toothbrushes when there were cuts, not going
Yes.
near them. You were open about your diagnosis with people.
Yes.
Did you experience any particularly problematic treatment or stigma when you were trying to access dental or medical treatment?
There was one dentist in Cheshire who refused me.
And did they give a reason for that refusal?
I got hepatitis C.
In the period prior to your first course of treatment for hepatitis C, how was your health generally?
Well, I was climbing. As I say, I was climbing with some of the best climbers in Britain by that stage. I mean, initially, the first 2 or 3 years when I worked for the British Mountaineering Council, we were in the hills most weekends. Yeah, I mean, I would be tired, but I could still do it. I mean, I was climbing into the extreme grades.
It was the middle of 1993 when you started your first treatment with alpha interferon. What can you recall about that treatment?
It's grim. It's just vile. And actually, funnily enough, because I've been so tired over the last 2 or 3 days, when I get tired, because I've been here too many days this week, I was recalling some of the symptoms because of my liver. When I get tired, the symptoms are basically like having a big hangover. When I was in interferon treatment, it was like a constant, permanent, huge, massive hangover, throbbing headache, nausea. There's a story about the nausea, actually.
Could we just pause there for a moment? I'm sorry, Bill, but
There's a problem with the
a problem with the
transcription.
transcript,
Oh,
which has arisen.
Yes.
I don't know if we need time to sort it out.
Yes, I'm sorry, we're going to need a few minutes. The transcriber's machine is now no longer accurately transcribing anything. Instead, we're getting...
Well, it's producing gibberish and you
Yes.
aren't.
I hope, sir, it's not my Scottish accent.
It's certainly not. It's certainly not. It's a technical error.
Well, shall we just take a short... Do we need a short break or not?
I think we will need a break to try and reboot the transcription.
I'm very,
machine.
very sorry about that. I'm sorry to all of you. But if we take a break for, I would hope it can be resolved in 5 minutes, we'll see how we go.
So for those listening and watching at home, we had a problem with the equipment on which the evidence is transcribed here in the hearing room, which has now been resolved.
Thank you.
Bill, you were describing the effects of that first course of treatment, like a very bad hangover.
Yep,
An effect.
constant for 12 months.
And you persisted with that treatment from June 93 to June 94.
Yep,
And what was the outcome of that treatment?
it failed.
1996, you returned to Edinburgh Royal Infirmary in terms of your care,
Yes,
and you embarked upon a second course of treatment with interferon in 1997, this time with ribavirin as well, I think.
yes. That was quick.
How long were you on that treatment for?
Well, it was only, I think it was less than 2 weeks, because I had a telephone call from the haemophilia unit. The words weren't quite, it's killing you, but it's doing you some very, very serious damage. My ALT levels had shot up to over 1,000.
You then embarked upon your third course of treatment in the period from August 2000 to February 2001, again interferon and ribavirin, I understand.
Pegylated interferon, ribavirin.
How was that course of treatment?
That was quite rough. That was pretty rough as well. The difference being that I only took 1 injection a week rather than 3 a week. The pegylated element was a sort of sugary substance to make it last longer. However, there was reason to stick with it, because within, I think, 2 months, 6 weeks, I actually went PCR negative. I think that was for the first time. And there was an incentive to endure it that time. And so I saw it through for the 6 months, and for, at least 4 out of the 6 months, I was PCR negative.
And you thought that this treatment might have beaten the hepatitis C,
We did.
but it transpired at the conclusion of the treatment or afterwards that was not the case.
Within a month, there were traces reappearing, and it came back with a bit of a vengeance, actually. However, the one, before we go on to talk about what happened thereafter, briefly, I took up road running because my viral load had been significantly decreased. And I say quite proudly, I managed to run a half marathon in 1 hour and didn't break the 150, but it was about 1 hour 51 minutes or something.
You've described the news that third course of treatment hadn't worked in one of your statements as devastating.
Life then went to pieces for the next 3-4 years. And this is the hardest bit of my evidence.
You say in your statement you lost your way in life for a period of time.
That would be, to put it mildly.
You've given an account in your written statements. It's entirely a matter for you, Bill, as to how much, if anything...
No, I can do this. It's okay. No, it's important. No, it's okay, Rosie. I've tried to analyse why this happened. I don't know if it was the disappointment of the treatment not working. I don't know if there was still vestiges of the interferon in my system, because it's well known it causes depression. I don't know if it was the hepatitis C when it came back. I don't know if it was because of my liver. or I don't know it's because of a character trait. And I use the words quite advisedly about character trait rather than character weakness or defect. But I became very severely depressed, extremely. I descended into a very, very deep depression to the point of being actively suicidal. And I fueled it with alcohol, and I became dependent upon alcohol. And this was at a period in our life where we had 2 young children. And there was a whole series of terrible events, things that I did that I am ashamed of, I feel guilty about, and I will regret to the day that I die. And thanks to the strength of an amazing wife, and some supportive friends and family, and an individual professional in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, by the end of 2005, there was a series of events that, rock bottom type events, that we pulled things around. The reason for my particular guilt is because of our son and daughter. And when we went through our statements and we brought all this back, it was hard. But actually, my son and daughter are the 2 most remarkable young adults, incredibly well adjusted, both with very good university degrees. They're sensitive, they're kind, and they're forward-looking. And one of the mottos that they gave me, that our children taught me, was deal with it and move on. And I am now not depressed. I got off the booze. I've been off the booze for 14 years. There were a couple of lapses that might come on to, but the last time I had a drink was over 10 years ago. I've listened to some stories about people who were affected in one way, and there's one particular story of a widow in Glasgow whose husband went down that road and never made it, and it breaks my heart. I was a bad person. I don't think I am a bad person. And where I was destructive, I try now to be constructive. And that, if you take all the episodes of when I was told that I might have only 10 years to live, there was time that I thought I was going to die when I had a liver biopsy, there was the false heart attack, and then there was a situation in 2015 where things weren't looking clever. It's not possible, but I would swap all of those if I could only relive those 4 years.
In 2007, after the period that you've just described,
Yep.
you embarked upon a 4th course of treatment for hepatitis C.
Yes.
What happened during that treatment and after it?
You could say it failed again. I failed. By then, the consultant, by 2007, I was 21 years into having the virus. And the consultant was quite anxious that we did something. And I got straightened out and we had another go. But it wasn't a good start because the night before it started was the report on Newsnight when Susan Watt did the report, actually about, by then, Professor Ludlam. And it failed.
And you experienced during that treatment similar side effects to those you've described with earlier treatments, nausea, fatigue. You've put it in your statement as being floored by the treatment.
Yeah. I was 4 mil down.
The principal consequence of that 4th course of treatment was to leave you with a condition of chronic fatigue.
Yes, that's correct. And one of the things that struck us about that was that having had the experience after the 3rd time where, after I completed the interferon, I was able to run the half marathon. We expected that at least I might get a bit of uplift, but it didn't happen, indeed quite the reverse. And I was medically retired at the age of 49. Not a great age to be in the scrap heap, really.
In the period from 2007 onwards, you've never regained your previous health?
No, I don't. Rosie may well talk about this, but the hills that I love, I simply don't have the energy, and I'd like to make a point about this, that people should be under no mistake about. I look perfectly healthy. People say you look so well. But the fatigue and the exhaustion and the time that I devote to this story can be completely overwhelming. I mean, this weekend, I'll sleep a lot. And interestingly enough, and I hope it doesn't affect me in terms of what I say at the end, but I actually recognised the symptoms of the fatigue in the last 24, 36 hours, where when one becomes very, very when I become very exhausted, it washes up through you, and you actually, you feel nausea, your appetite's affected, and you have that headaches there. And I mean, life's so much better than it was back in 2001 to 2005, but it's just there, that fatigue. And much of the time, frankly, in a situation like this, I think I'm probably operating on adrenaline. But then, when those particular situations are over, I have to go back. Very often I have to have a rest in the afternoon.
In 2015,
Oh, yeah.
you embarked upon a further course of treatment for hepatitis C. What was your physical health like at the time, and what advice and information were you given that prompted that treatment?
This is a point that I think Rosie might answer better than I. But ironically, at the time that the Penrose inquiry report came out, March 25th, 2015, and the following day, 2016, I was experiencing this feeling of exhaustion, but also the adrenaline pushed back. So we got through it. I'll forever be indebted to Dr. Julie Anderson, actually, because it was her. She said, "I'm speaking to you not as a haemophilia consultant, I'm speaking to you as a haematologist. Your white cell count, neutrophils, are going down below normal, and your platelets are down below normal. And that's an indicator of going in the direction of non-Hodgkin's or carcinoma or whatever." And we weren't, well. And I was persuaded to consider a fifth attempt at treating the virus. One of the options involved interfering. And I was absolutely adamant that I would not accept it. I frankly would rather have paid the ultimate price and died with dignity than go back in that stuff. So, there was obviously quite a lot of toing and froing between my health board, and which is Tayside, and Lothian Health Board, where it was treated, and an agreement was made to treat me with diclatosphere, sofosbuvir, and ribavirin. And that treatment, which originally was supposed to be for 24 weeks and would have cost tens and tens and tens of thousands of pounds, was much easier to endure. And I now have a sustained viral response. I'm left with a scarred liver, liver cirrhosis, and I have a lymph node in my liver about that size, but it's not getting bigger, and a bulge in my liver, and it's scarred. But that treatment meant that I wasn't suddenly going to go like that.
Although the treatment cleared the virus, you have been left, as I understand it, with the chronic fatigue condition that you previously described. That has not been eradicated by the treatment.
I think it's important to emphasise here that I have quite a high public visibility, and I'm the chairman of a charity which takes up a fair bit of my time, focus and energy. This inquiry obviously currently takes up a fair bit of my time, focus and energy, but I am drained. Many of us are drained. And I mean, I am able to be more active. I can play a round of golf. Not brilliantly, but I'm not giving up on life. I mean, I think if my time in life is to be shortened because my life expectation since 1988 has been shortened. I want to use that time positively, constructively and usefully, and if I'm tired, then I have to go to my bed. And I have as well as wanting to be positive and constructive, I also have a bit of a bucket list. My daughter's arranged for me to jump out of a plane in a couple of weeks. But you don't have to use a great deal of energy when you jump out of a plane tied to a red devil, really.
You have described in your written statement being infected as the defining factor in your life.
Yes.
And you have said that never a day goes by when you do not reflect on what might have been.
Yes. I mean, in some ways, I can't change I can't turn the clock back. But obviously, as someone who's reasonably, I was about to say, and I'm stuck for words, I was about to say reasonably articulate and reasonably intelligent. I do wonder what I might have achieved in life professionally and reflect on that. But no, it didn't happen, and I try and use my time to the best of what I can do.
And having had to retire medically in 2007, as you've explained, you have spent many of the following years working for Haemophilia Scotland.
Yes. Frankly, we set it up.
You have contact with hundreds of people who have been infected or affected in consequence of that work.
Yes.
And you've said in your statement you feel a sense of duty.
Absolutely.
And
It's inescapable.
And a responsibility to allow their stories to be heard.
I keep telling people the job that I have is to open doors and introduce people to each other so that we can support each other. And Rosie's not very happy about it because of the time and energy and focus it involves. But because she gets the sharp end of the stick when I'm really tired. But I'm so committed after the horror of the Penrose inquiry to see things happen better. I believe in this inquiry. Very strongly, sir. And I believe not only in what you're doing, but your very human and able team. And the sense of warmth and support that we've all had this time round in Scotland, compared to the previous occasion, is something that I think I might venture for all is much appreciated.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the financial consequences of what you've described.
Yeah.
Lost an income through giving up work. I'll be asking Rosie as well to talk about that. Is there anything that you in particular would wish to say about that?
I wonder if at a later date, when the inquiry is investigating its various issues and comes to discuss the Scottish schemes, as someone who had a very significant hand in establishing those schemes in Scotland, I might be invited to comment at that point.
Well, you've anticipated, Bill, in fact, my next question, which was whether you had any comments you wanted to make at this stage about Skipton or the SIBSS, but if you want to defer
well,
that,
If you would
that's
prefer
fine.
to leave those comments till later, then we shall see what we can do. I won't make promises which I might not be able to keep.
No, of course, sir.
But we will see what we can do to accommodate them. And certainly, certainly in writing,
Yeah,
no question about that.
okay. The question of money. The facts are, on the following the advice of Dr. Evans, in 1996, we eventually served a summons in 1999. 20 years later, that legal action is unresolved. In terms of my loss of income, I mean, I refer to what I said earlier in terms of I just don't know what I would have achieved in life. Rosie, until the last 2 or 3 years, has been the main bread earner by far in our family.
And you've said in your statement one thing that's made a difference in the last 2 or 3 years, and you can deal with this in more detail in due course, has been the payments that you are now received through SIBS.
Yes. I mean, I will, when I sum up, say something with regard to the general situation in terms of damages or compensation.
In terms of the impact on Rosie and on your children, I'm going to ask Rosie about that to the extent that she wants to deal with it. Is there anything that you would like to say at this stage about that?
No, because if I start to talk about this lady sitting on my right, I'll end up in that floor in a howling mess.
I'll leave that then. The final matter I was going to ask you about, Bill, is really one you've touched on already, and that was about the Penrose inquiry. I wasn't going to ask you about any detailed commentary on its outcomes, but just about its impact on your life and the amount of time you spent on it.
I was a core participant in the Penrose inquiry, and at the time that it started, which was about 2008, I think it was, and I think it was by 2009, we were getting toward the initial hearings. I was still very low in self-confidence following what happened in 2007. Haemophilia Scotland didn't exist. I had no position. And the reason that we ended up toward the end of the inquiry, where obviously on the day the report came out, I had a very high profile, and indeed the following day when the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, responded, we'd formed Haemophilia Scotland. Originally, we had been asked to form a Scottish committee of the Haemophilia Society, the UK Haemophilia Society. Within a year, we decided that because of devolution, that we wanted to do our own thing, and Wales and Northern Ireland have followed since. And that meant that as the inquiry went on, I had more and more of a role in terms of briefing our legal team. And however, that inquiry was entirely different. And I'm going to make a point when I sum up here. To give an idea of for those who didn't experience the Penrose inquiry, when the chairman came into the room, we had to stand. We were there We were never acknowledged by the chairman. We had to fight to get changes, and I mean really fight to get changes to the list of topics. Spent hours. I remember one particular day where we were on the island of Colonsay, and the mobile phone reception on the island of Colonsay is not great. And Mr. Dawson here wanted some briefing in order to respond to Lord Penrose. So we're sort of trying to drive backwards and forwards in the hotel, and I mean it took a couple of days out of our holiday. I remember, as well as when the report was presented, the last day, well, there was actually two last days. The last official day, everybody was thanked for all the efforts they'd made, including the security staff and the cleaners. But the chairman didn't thank the core participants, even though we had devoted so much time. I am entirely confident, sir, that will not happen with this inquiry. And then we had the extra day about statistics, where, frankly, we have to, I think, offer a degree of sympathy, but the chairman was frankly rude to our council and those sitting behind him, as he called them. So it was not a particularly edifying exercise, and what then followed on, however, was much more positive. And I remember the day after, because the difficulty in terms of, if I can explain what happened in relation to the public understanding of that day. We'd known for a week beforehand that this report was going to be, we'd known about it only having a single recommendation, and we thought, if you'll excuse me, oh shit, this is going to be rough. And so we'd been advised to set up a press conference in response, not in a different building, but there. And with the help of Dan Farthing, we'd organised a no-media event in St Augustine's Church nearby that afternoon, basically so that we could, away from the media, give people the opportunity to comfort each other. And the First Minister of Scotland and the Cabinet Minister for Health and the Public Health Minister came and just sat and listened to stories. And that was the start of something entirely new in Scotland, an approach that was never taken in London. However, when the poor secretary of that inquiry had, in the absence of the chairman, delivered that report, and people at the back were starting to become very agitated, she stopped and all hell let loose, but we had a press conference to deliver. And I felt, we cannot let this happen. We have to stick together. And it was one of the hardest moments of my life. And there was someone who came up and supported me, who's present today. And I went out in front of that group of people. Half of them was the nation's media. All you see on the television now is the burning of that damned report. But we stuck in there. And we, I believe, pulled that around. I was very passionate in response, and I thought, how the hell are we going to pull this around? Because people were so angry. And I remember ripping off the Penrose sign. But I also remember thinking, this is not fair on a relatively junior officer of an inquiry. It wasn't even a QC that delivered the report, who had to deliver this bad news. So here's me with a suit on. I went up and shook her hand and said, that could not have been easy to do. And of course, people present who didn't know us just thought there's a guy in a suit shaking her hand, congratulating her. But the story was actually very different. And I will never ever forget that day. We dealt with the nation's press, and from then on, we've had a working relationship with government in Scotland. And I think that's really important, sir, in terms of the recommendations of this inquiry. We don't make progress by throwing mud at people. We have to talk to government. It's vital. There's a member of the Scottish Government here today who I admire. And we need to be constructive. We need to look forward. And if we're going to get a resolution to this story, it's important that we reach our hands out rather than throw mud.
Bill, those are the questions I have for you, but I know that there's more that you wanted to say.
Yeah. I'm sorry I've kept everyone back for so long. I'm going to stand up. I hope I don't become over emotional because I am extremely tired. But I want to stand up, sir, because I stand up with respect to you. But the people I'm really standing up for are these people that the camera can't see. I look around this room and I see a woman that's lost her father, a man who could have had a couple of men who could have had a real working life, a man whose memory is badly affected, a man with a liver disease, a man who had a liver transplant, a woman who's devoted 30 years of her life to a husband with HIV and AIDS. I see a daughter whose father I knew who died, and another wife who lost her husband. I see some parents who've devoted their life to the care of their son. I see another woman, another widow, who lost not only her husband, but her whole livelihood. I see a man who's had other health problems, who continues to live with the impact of hepatitis C. I see people not only from Scotland, but from Northern Ireland. And I think about the people who might be looking into this via the web. I think about a woman, bedridden, living alone in one of the remotest parts of Scotland, helpless, lonely. People from Aberdeen, a man in a wheelchair, infected with AIDS, who's blind, who's had cancer, and somehow he's still alive. I think of a woman who not only lost her husband from AIDS, but she herself was infected with AIDS too. I think of a woman in Newcastle who lost her husband from AIDS, who's had no recognition. I think of people who need to move house because of the illness that they face and struggle to do so. There are so many, and they include obviously the wee boys with parents losing sons, particularly from York Hill. And I stand in awe, and I'm not being impertinent, sir, I stand in awe at these people. But I also look here to the lawyers, particularly those of you who represent governments, central legal offices, and so on and so forth. And governments, for me, we've got two people here in Scotland today. Ask them what they're going to do about this. I asked the media not to report how emotional I am about this. Go and ask these guys who want to be our Prime Minister. Go and ask them what they're going to do about this disaster. The Prime Minister, and this is a paper that I've been sent, it's not on relativity, sir, I was sent it prior to this inquiry. Back in 1990, there's an internal document from Downing Street where the then Prime Minister, the man who preached family values, said the Prime Minister, however, feared that a judge might be prevailed upon to allow time-expired cases to be brought. He was worried that one of these cases might succeed, which would be presented by the campaign as a victory on general issues. In other words, he didn't want us to win. Where's the humanity in that? Where's the compassion? When we ask the leaders of our country if they're fit to be leaders, how do you judge these people? And I asked you as lawyers, particularly those of you who are here on behalf of government, to go home today and examine your consciences and reach deep down into your very personal souls. I don't believe you're bad people, but you are people who advise. And you need to advise with compassion and humanity. So, sir, I stand, we all stand, and we will continue to do so until this matter's resolved. I thank you.
Bill, I'm just going to ask Mr. O'Neill and Mr. Dawson if there's anything to add. No.
Bill, you have stood for us, for them, for me. It will not surprise me if in thanking you for your testimony this morning, they stand for you. Thank you. We'll take a break for lunch.
Is that okay? Is that okay?
And we'll come back at Shall we make it 25 past 1? I think that gives us all time for lunch. Would you like the hour?
No, I'm just apologising about the time, sir.
Was that all right?
No, I'm apologising it took so much time.
No, don't apologise. It had to be heard. At 25 past 1.